Nicole de Hauteclocque, from Resistance, fighter to general after the war. YouTube script, English, US, approx. 2226, Man Red, June 6, 1944. The Normandy beaches are on fire. American and British soldiers storm the shore under a curtain of German artillery. Thousands are dying in the surf. But 20 miles inland, in the dense bocage country of northern France, a young Frenchwoman crouches in a ditch. She is 23 years old. She's holding a Sten submachine gun. Her name is Nicole de Hauteclocque, and she has been at war longer than most of the men who just landed on that beach. She is not a soldier, not officially. She has no rank, no uniform, no military ID. If the Germans catch her, she will not be treated as a prisoner of war. She will be tortured. She will be shot. Or she will be sent to a camp from which no one returns. She knows this. She has known it since she was 19 years old, since the day she looked at an occupied France and decided she could not simply wait for someone else to fight. This is the story of how that young woman became one of the most quietly decorated fighters of the French resistance, how she smuggled weapons, organized escape lines, coordinated with British intelligence, and helped liberate her country from the inside, and how, decades later, the French Republic would give her the highest honor it could offer, how Nicole de Hauteclocque eventually wore the stars of a general. But first, let us go back to the beginning. Nicole de Hauteclocque was born on March 5, 1921, in Paris, France. She came from a prominent aristocratic family, a name that carried weight in French society and a lineage that stretched back centuries. The Hautecloques were Catholic, conservative, and deeply patriotic. Service to France was not merely a duty in this family, it was a calling. Her cousin was Philippe de Hauteclocque, who would go on to become one of the most celebrated French military commanders of the Second World War, fighting under the name Philippe Leclerc, the man who would lead the Free French forces into Paris in August 1944. Military valor ran in her blood. Nicole grew up in comfort, received an excellent education, and came of age in a France that was slowly being strangled by political crisis, economic depression, and the long shadow of Nazi Germany. By the time she was a teenager, the Axis powers were remaking the map of Europe. By the time she was 18, France was at war. In May 1940, Germany launched its devastating blitzkrieg through the Ardennes. Within 6 weeks, the French army collapsed. On June 22, 1940, France signed an armistice. The country was divided, the North and West under direct German occupation, the South under the collaborationist Vichy regime. Paris fell. The swastika flew from the Eiffel Tower. Nicole de Hauteclocque was 19 years old. For millions of French people, the armistice was a humiliation, but also a relief, a chance to survive, to adapt, to wait. For others, it was simply unacceptable. Nicole was in the second group. Almost immediately, she began looking for ways to resist. Joining the French resistance in 1940 was not like joining an army. There was no recruitment office, no enlistment form, no chain of command. It was a loose, dangerous, and often chaotic network of individuals who found each other through trust, through shared fury, through the patient and terrifying process of figuring out who could be relied upon. Nicole made contact with early resistance networks in Paris. She was young, educated, and, crucially, she had a name that opened doors. But the aristocratic surname could also be a liability. The Germans were watching families with military connections. She had to be careful. She began with what many women in the resistance began with: courier work, carrying messages, documents, false identity papers, and intelligence across checkpoints, through German patrols, into safe houses. It sounds simple. It was not. A single misstep, a paper out of order, a suspicious look, the wrong answer at a checkpoint, could mean arrest, interrogation, and death. Nicole proved extraordinarily good at this work. She was calm, composed, and young enough to pass as an ordinary student or shop girl. She learned to read German soldiers, to gauge when a checkpoint officer was bored and waving people through versus when he was scrutinizing faces. She learned that the best cover was not invisibility, it was ordinariness. Confident ordinariness. She expanded her activities. She began working with escape networks, the systems that helped Allied airmen shot down over France, Jewish families fleeing persecution, and Frenchmen evading forced labor to cross into Spain or Switzerland or get to Britain. These were extraordinarily dangerous operations. Every safe house was a potential death trap. Every guide could be a Gestapo informant. Nicole navigated this world for years. By 1942, the nature of the resistance was changing. The Germans had extended the occupation to the formerly unoccupied zone in November of that year, following the Allied landings in North Africa. All of France was now under direct Nazi control. The Gestapo, the German secret state police, had intensified its operations. Resistance networks were being rolled up one by one. Arrests cascaded through cells. Torture extracted names. Names led to more arrests. It was a brutal, grinding attrition. And yet the resistance grew. Nicole de Hauteclocque was now working at a level of operational seriousness that went far beyond courier work. She was coordinating, organizing, liaising with Special Operations Executive, the British agency responsible for supporting resistance activities across occupied Europe. The SOE had been parachuting agents into France since 1941, and they needed French contacts they could trust absolutely. Nicole was one of those contacts. The SOE work meant handling radio communications, receiving supply drops, weapons, explosives, currency, medical supplies, coordinating their distribution, and helping to plan sabotage operations. It meant knowing that somewhere above you, in a slow-moving Halifax or Lysander aircraft, a British agent or a supply canister was dropping through the dark. It meant showing up at a field in the dead of night, flashing a coded signal, and carrying crates of Sten guns through the countryside before dawn. It was physically grueling, logistically complex, and one wrong move away from catastrophe. In this period, Nicole was also active in gathering and passing intelligence. What were the Germans doing in this region? Where were their depots? What were their troop movements? This information, passed to London, shaped Allied bombing raids and operational planning. In a very real sense, Nicole de Hauteclocque was contributing directly to the war in ways that most people with official uniforms were not. 1943 was the year the resistance hardened. The milice, Vichy France's paramilitary police force, became operational in January 1943 and proved in many ways more dangerous than the Germans themselves. They knew the terrain, they knew the language, they had local informants, they were French collaborators who hunted French resistors with a ferocity born of ideological conviction or personal vengeance. Nicole operated in this landscape. She was aware that people she had worked with were being arrested. She was aware that she herself was at risk. She moved. She changed identities. She relied on a rotating network of safe houses. She trusted carefully and narrowly. There is a particular psychological weight to this kind of existence that is difficult to convey without having lived it. You cannot relax. You cannot confide. You cannot let your guard down in a cafe, in a shop, on the street. Every stranger is a potential informer. Every neighbor who asks too many questions is a threat. You carry a persona that is not yours, and you carry it perfectly, 24 hours a day, for months and years. Nicole de Hauteclocque carried it. She also carried a gun. By this stage of the war, she was no longer merely a courier or a coordinator. She was a combatant. She participated in armed operations, ambushes of German supply convoys, sabotage of infrastructure, railroads, telephone lines, fuel depots. The guerrilla warfare that the resistance conducted in the run-up to the Allied invasion was intended to slow German reinforcements, disrupt communications, and tie down troops that might otherwise be deployed against the Normandy beaches. Nicole was part of this effort. Armed, trained, dangerous. Which brings us back to June 1944. When the Allies landed on June 6th, the resistance received the signal they had been waiting for. Coded messages broadcast over the BBC French service, lines of poetry that meant, "The invasion has begun. Activate your operations." Networks across France immediately began conducting coordinated sabotage. Rail lines were cut in hundreds of places. German reinforcements moving toward Normandy found roads blocked, bridges destroyed, convoys ambushed. Nicole de Hauteclocque was in the thick of it. In the weeks following D-Day, she operated in the region of Normandy and the surrounding countryside, working with resistance forces that were now operating in something closer to open warfare. The Germans were increasingly desperate, increasingly brutal. Reprisals against French civilians were vicious. Entire villages were massacred for harboring or cooperating with the resistance. The SS division, Das Reich, moving north from Toulouse, murdered 642 men, women, and children in the village of Oradour-sur-Glane on June 10, 1944. Nicole knew what the stakes were. She had always known. She continued to operate, to fight, to coordinate, as the Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches. She was working alongside men who often had more trouble accepting a woman in their ranks than the Germans had providing her with targets. The resistance was not immune to the social norms of 1940s France. A woman carrying a weapon, giving orders, assessing tactical situations. This was not how it was supposed to work, according to many of her male comrades. She did not ask for their approval. She had a war to fight. Paris was liberated on August 25, 1944. General Philippe Leclerc, Nicole's cousin, led his armored division into the city. It was one of the most emotionally charged moments of the entire war. 4 years of occupation, 4 years of humiliation and collaboration, and resistance and survival, and suddenly the streets were filled with people weeping and cheering and throwing flowers and kissing soldiers. Nicole was there, or close to it, in the turbulent days surrounding the liberation. But the war was not over. The Germans were still fighting. The Rhine had not been crossed. There were still months of brutal combat ahead in eastern France, in the Ardennes, in Germany itself, and Nicole de Hauteclocque continued to serve. With the liberation, she was able to join the Free French forces in a more formal capacity. She served in a nursing and medical role in the latter stages of the war, traveling with military units as they pushed east. She witnessed the aftermath of battles. She saw what war did to bodies and to minds. She helped care for the wounded and the dying. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. It was a day of enormous celebration and enormous exhaustion. Those who had fought in the resistance, who had risked everything for years, who had lost friends and comrades and pieces of themselves, celebrated. And then they tried to go home. Going home was complicated. For many resistance fighters, the post-war period was a psychological ordeal. The skills they had developed, suspicion, compartmentalization, violence, did not simply switch off. The networks they had relied on dissolved, the comrades they had depended on scattered, and the official France, rebuilding itself, was not always eager to look too closely at what had actually happened during the occupation. Some collaborators escaped justice. Some resistors found their sacrifices minimized or forgotten. For women who had fought in the resistance, the post-war period was often especially difficult. France granted women the right to vote for the first time in 1944, a recognition that was long overdue. But cultural attitudes changed slowly. Women who had taken up arms, who had killed, who had operated at the highest levels of clandestine warfare, many were simply expected to go back to being wives and mothers and secretaries. Nicole de Hauteclocque did not go back. She had found, in the years of resistance and war, something that she could not simply set aside: a vocation, a sense of purpose, a commitment to service that the armistice had awakened in her and the years of fighting had deepened. She entered a formal military career. The path Nicole took after the war was extraordinary and, at the time, almost without precedent for a woman in France. She pursued a career in military nursing and medical service, rising through the ranks of the French military health service. This was a field where women were accepted. But even here, advancement to the highest levels required extraordinary capability and determination. She brought both. Over the following decades, Nicole de Hauteclocque proved to be an outstanding military officer. She was organized, intelligent, strategically minded, and possessed of the kind of unflappable competence under pressure that years of clandestine warfare had forged in her. She rose steadily through the ranks. She also carried with her the deep moral seriousness of someone who had seen what war actually was, not as an abstraction, not as a game of tactics and strategy, but as something that happened to human bodies and human minds. She had helped carry the wounded. She had closed the eyes of the dead. She understood, in a way that purely academic military education cannot teach, what was at stake when decisions were made. This understanding shaped her leadership. She served in France and in French overseas territories. She participated in the reconstruction of French military medical institutions. She helped train the next generation of military medical personnel. She was, by all accounts, a demanding but deeply respected figure, someone whose expectations were high because she had seen what happened when preparation and professionalism were lacking. The recognition that came to Nicole de Hauteclocque over the decades was substantial, though it came, as it often does for women who served in the resistance, more slowly than it might have for a man with a comparable record. She received the Croix de Guerre, the French military decoration for acts of bravery in the face of the enemy, for her resistance service. She received the Médaille de la Résistance. She was made a Chevalier of the Légion d'honneur and later elevated to higher grades within that order. These were significant honors. But the most extraordinary recognition came later in her career. Nicole de Hauteclocque was eventually promoted to the rank of general in the French military. She became one of the very first women to hold general officer rank in the history of the French armed forces. When she was given her stars, she wore them as the culmination of a journey that had begun in a ditch in occupied France, with a Sten gun and a set of false identity papers. Think about what that means. A teenager who had no army to join, who had no one to tell her what to do, who simply decided that France needed her and acted on that decision. That teenager ended her career as a general officer in the military of the republic she had helped save. France does not hand out that rank lightly. There is a particular quality to Nicole de Hauteclocque's story that deserves a moment of reflection. She was not famous during the war. She was not a legend in the mold of Jean Moulin, the iconic resistance leader who was captured and tortured to death by the Gestapo in 1943. She did not have a famous face or a famous name, or rather, she had a famous name, but it was her cousin's fame, not hers. She worked in the shadows, which was the only way to work if you wanted to survive. The shadow was the point, and this is true of so many of the people, and especially so many of the women who fought in the French resistance. They were invisible by design. They were ordinary by necessity. The courier who passed through the checkpoint was supposed to look like any other young woman going to market. The safe housekeeper was supposed to look like any other housewife. The operative receiving weapons drops was supposed to leave no trace. That invisibility saved their lives. And it also meant that their contributions were easy to overlook afterward. France has done better than many countries in recognizing resistance service. The memorials exist, the archives are there, the decorations were awarded. But the full weight of what these individuals did, the years of sustained courage, the daily risk, the psychological cost, the willingness to kill and to die for an idea of France, is difficult to hold in the mind properly. Nicole de Hauteclocque's story asks us to try. She represents something important, not just as an individual, but as a symbol of a particular kind of courage. The courage that does not wait for permission. The courage that looks at an impossible situation and says, I will do what I can with what I have starting now. She was 19 when France fell. She did not have a plan. She did not have training. She did not have official sanction. She had a name, a brain, a willingness to act, and a profound sense of what France was supposed to stand for. Liberté, égalité, fraternité, values that were being trampled by the boots of an occupying army and the collaboration of a cowardly regime. She decided those values were worth fighting for, and she fought. She fought for years, in the dark, without applause, without rank, without pay. She fought alongside men who sometimes doubted her and enemies who would have killed her on sight. She fought through fear and grief and exhaustion and the particular despair of living a double life in a country that had lost itself. And then, when the war was over, she kept going. She built a career in the institution she had served unofficially for years. She rose through ranks that had barely existed for women when she first picked up a weapon. She earned the stars that sit on the shoulders of those who have truly given everything. She is not as famous as she should be. Very few of them are. If you have been watching this channel for any length of time, you know that this is something we come back to again and again. The gap between what these people actually did and how much of the world knows about it. The resistance fighters of France, the women who served, who fought, who died, who survived and carried the weight of what they had seen for the rest of their lives, they deserve to be remembered, not as myths, not as symbols detached from reality, but as people. As a young woman from a good family who decided that comfort was not enough, that survival was not enough, that if her country was going to be free, someone was going to have to fight for that freedom. And if no one else was available, she would do it herself. That is Nicole de Hauteclocque. She died having lived one of the most remarkable lives of the 20th century. She carried a Sten gun through occupied France and ended her career wearing the stars of a general. She is proof, concrete, documented, irrefutable proof, that courage has no gender. France knows this. It took time to say it properly, but France knows. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video. It costs you nothing, and it helps more people find these stories. If you are new here, consider subscribing. We tell the stories of the people history should not forget. And wherever you are watching this from, whether you are in France, in the United States, in the UK, in Argentina, or anywhere else in the world, thank you. Thank you for sitting with these stories. Thank you for keeping the memory alive. Leave a comment below and tell us where you are watching from. We read everyone. History belongs to all of us. The least we can do is learn it. End of script.